congratulations on this. Do Not Resist. Very, very important film. How did it come about? And how long did it take you to put everything together while everything else was unfolding around the country?
Sure. We started about a year prior to Ferguson. So we started, my first interest in this topic was, I was watching the Boston Marathon bombing and the days after the Boston Marathon bombing. And it was the first time I saw the level of equipment that police had been given post 9/11. And also the mentality with which the officers were approaching the community, I thought was completely devoid from what I remember of a protect and serve model. I was comparing this to my family history because my father was a police officer for 29 years outside of Detroit. And he was actually a SWAT officer for 13 of those years. And so I remember the war on drugs era of policing, and what I saw in the days unfolding in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing was completely different. I mean, his era was by no means perfect, but something surely had escalated. And so that was my initial interest. So again, we were starting about a year prior to the events in Ferguson. When Ferguson happened, obviously, it became a story of national interest, and then it became very difficult for us because it was almost as if we were trying to hit a moving target. Everyone had their talking points and their ideas about what was causing this and the direction we should go. And so for us, it became very difficult to try to incorporate all that into our film, and that's why in the third act of the film, we point people to the future, because a lot of people were looking at the programs that had taken place for 30 years, the 1033 program and giving the equipment to police departments. But while that was going on, there's something far more nefarious creeping in underneath it, and that was this level of surveillance technology that police have been starting to adapt as the wars abroad wind down. A lot of the officers working in their surveillance space have gone into the private sector and now selling that same surveillance technology to police departments for small money on the dollar. And so that was a portion of this story that people weren't really looking towards while we were talking about the militarization of police, which is why in the last third act of the film we point people to that direction, because I think that's actually what's coming.
When you told your dad you were doing this movie, what was his response?
Well, I can tell you what he said when he saw the movie, and he was devastated by the film. I mean, he appreciates what I do as a filmmaker, but seeing a profession that he's dedicated his life to evolve into something that I know he would never want to be a part of, it was very difficult for him to watch. I mean, for example, he was on SWAT for 13 years, and they did 29 search warrants in that time. Contrast that to teams that I was going out with during making this film. They're doing it 3 to 4 times a day, over 200 times a year. So there's been a significant increase, and in his era of SWAT was used for the one-off opportunity of a barricaded gunman or a hostage situation, and it was it was implemented and used very rarely. Now SWAT has evolved into a routine part of SWAT work, and many counties in the country have teams that are full-time teams. St. Louis County, every single felony search warrant in that community is served by the SWAT team. And so you can imagine there's plenty of felonies that don't need that type of armament, to be served. But again, they're using a police entity that was supposed to be used for specific cases, and now they're rolling it out and have been using it for routine police work.
I saw 4 or 5 films that wanted to touch on these aspects of things, and they weren't any good. This is the first film that I saw that really got it. And the footage that you got not only in Congress about talking about those searches, I thought that was really important. And I'm a know-it-all news junkie because I started in there from the 80s. But that part touched me because I'm like, what? They're doing that?
Right.
Talk about that aspect. That was really intense that you brought that up.
You're saying with what's happening within Congress, you're saying, or with giving the equipment? Both Congress and... What was the other aspect?
And talking about the searchers, because we've never seen that before.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. When I was beginning to introduce that I wanted to make this film to people, people thought I was a conspiracy theorist or something. That what do you mean the militarization of police? And no one was really understanding. I mean, I wasn't pitching it to them at the time because I was just more curious to know what had happened, but. No one was really, buying into it or believing it. And so I knew that I would have to put the camera in situations where people could see for themselves and just get a chance to observe and go behind some of the headlines that we've been hearing since, Ferguson. What does a search warrant look like? We all know what it looks like when we see it on TV show Cops or Dallas SWAT, but that's always from a perspective where we're glorifying the officers and kind of condemning the accused with pixelated faces and leaving it like that. And I wanted to shoot something which was much more neutral, and so audiences could decide for themselves what that looked like. And so we were trying to put the camera in a space where it could be, very observational. We had the opportunity to see a live, congressional hearing where, our elected officials are trying to bring the DOD and the DHS and the Justice Department to task on how are you, releasing this equipment to people? Do you have any oversights, to this equipment going out? And the answer was no. What was so disheartening, although that was a fantastic scene, turned out to be a great scene in the film, what came of that hearing? Nothing. And it was so disheartening to see the fact that although our elected officials were trying to bring these entities to task, they really didn't have too much power over them. And it was disheartening because I'm like, well, who's in charge here? If our elected officials can't bring the military-industrial complex to task and are asking very legit questions on how they're releasing this equipment into the field, but they have no answers for them, and then nothing comes of that, to me, begs the question of who's actually in control here.
As a filmmaker and seeing that, what did that do from your perspective? Because you have to stay neutral the best that you can because you're telling a story.
Yeah.
But what did, I'm sure your eyebrows raised behind the camera, listening and seeing this too.
Very much. What people continue to say to us is, thank you so much for making a piece that doesn't just, condemn officers, because we certainly don't need that in this time. But they say that you're there and that you're observing and that they almost condemn themselves, And time and time again, I kept seeing how I felt that police officers were very much trapped in the middle at times. I mean, there are, bad apples, as they say, and I think there's some bad orchards, if you will, there's some departments that are completely not doing the right thing. But I often see that, a lot of police officers sign up to protect and serve. And then they go into the force and they're given top-down objectives that put them at odds with their community. When you're going out and raising revenue for your department by seizing assets, you're essentially asking the police officers to be de facto tax collectors for their city, and you're treating the citizens like ATMs. So you're taking the police entity, which is supposed to be designed to protect and serve, and you flip that, and you've put it, you've put the police and the citizens directly at odds with one another. And so again, I kept trying to show opportunities where it would show the nuance of that situation, where it's not black and white and it's not just all bad cops. There's nuance there, and there are people trying to do it right, but the top-down messaging and objectives that they're given to these police officers is putting them at odds. Now, that said, there's plenty of officers that are not doing it right, and we need to also find a way to bring those officers to justice and hold them accountable, and that's something that we're not seeing throughout the country. So that actually needs to be changed as well. But all that to say, it's not obviously all bad police officers. There's more nuance in the situation. So, as we started to go through the course of making the film, we kept thinking that we would find opportunities to show perhaps how this equipment could be used effectively. Take the Pulse nightclub, for example, where they used an armored vehicle, punctured a hole in the side of the building, and was able to free hostages. That's a fantastic use of this equipment, and I thought that we would be able to demonstrate that. However, that's such a rare occurrence with the use of SWAT, and what we actually show is what's happening on a day-to-day basis. When you're looking at the statistics of SWAT deployments, and right now there's about 80,000 SWAT deployments a year, over 90% of those are for search warrants, and oftentimes those are for low-level drug offenses. So unfortunately, we don't show the full breadth of the SWAT experience, where you would see it, for example, in use in a good way. But what we show is what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And I thought that was very important to put out there in a very stark way so that people can see what's happening on a day-to-day basis. Because that's obviously the area that needs the most attention and the most cause for reform.
Talk about, you've had it at other film festivals so far. Talk about the reactions, what you've seen so far.
So we've had a very interesting opportunity to screen at film festivals throughout the country, and one thing that I'm so encouraged by is the fact that we've been able to screen at some police departments and police academies. One was the John Jay Criminal Justice College in New York City, which is the feeder school for the NYPD. And active duty NYPD officers got up and stated publicly that thanks for making this film. I think it reflects reality. It shows the area that we actually need to reform. One NYPD SWAT commander got up and tried to put some distance between what the NYPD does and some of the training and the messaging that you see in the film from trainers like Dave Grossman. And he said, hey, we've moved away from that model. So he was trying to put distance between that over-aggressive mentality and what they do. So more than anything, I mean, the audiences have been very shocked and very thankful that they get an opportunity to see many of these things that we've heard since Ferguson. You actually get to experience it and see it. But I'm even more encouraged by the fact that law enforcement is embracing it as a teaching tool. I think that's the audience that I really would like this film to affect, because if this film can be used as a teaching tool, then we can start to open the conversation of how we're training our officers, and is it the best policy to run in homes for what turns out to be 1.5 grams of weed, and when the officer says, oh, we find stuff 50-50. These are the types of questions that I'd like to bring up. Is it okay to only find contraband 50% of the time when you're using this, aggressive mentalities running into a home? So I think that if we can get the film to more, to the law enforcement community to start those discussions, I'm more encouraged by that than anything. But certainly citizens also have appreciated a visual example. I don't think we're saying anything new to communities who have been experiencing this for decades. People have been saying that this has been a problem for decades, and there's a lot of law enforcement officers who have been trying to change the culture of their departments. So hopefully we're dropping down a visual example of areas that actually need to reform, that the community and law enforcement officers can take a hold of and say, yes, this is what we're talking about. These are the areas that we actually need to reform. So long term, I hope it plays a contributing role into that reform.
Last question. What would you say to get the audience to come out to support Do Not Resist?
Well, I think that it's an experiential experience, for lack of a better term. It's something that I think we justified the visual medium, whereas it's not something that could live in book form. It's not something that could live in an article. It's best suited to be observed, and we made a film that was designed for theaters, mostly for the fact that we thought that people seeing it in a communal space, it would spark post-screening discussions that would be much more lively than people sitting behind their laptops and experiencing it on their own. And so we created a film to be experienced in spaces together, and I think that we did do our part in justifying the visual medium. So I hope that people do come out and see it in that format, because I think that's where it's most impactful.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Very good.
Thank you, guys.